are so many people on a Friday afternoon.
So
It's
much.
actually a bit sunny, willing to listen to a discussion about the EU budget.
Exactly.
That's the blowings.
Okay, so these days I always try and start conversations or at least get something positive in. So all budgeting, we know from our own personal, on our own households, inflation is a killer. And inflation complicates government budgeting and it complicates EU, any kind of budgeting. So the good news is, I know it sort of gets made terrible, the ECB raised interest rates unwisely, in my view, yesterday, but the ECB doesn't think inflation this year is going to, will be sort of average 3%. Now that's too high, but it's nothing like 2021, 22. Can't stress that enough, folks, as an economist. We've seen many examples of inflation rising in the 80s, the 90s with higher energy costs, but we didn't have a burst of inflation. 21, 22, we had a big burst of inflation, the first in 40 years, but that was the pandemic, not energy. So the good news is that planners don't have to look, unless something else goes radically wrong, don't have to worry about the pandemic. So if I could tee it up with that sort of as a relatively positive start, as always, 1 billion hours of bureaucrat time will go into this. Will this be more difficult or about the same as previous 7-year EU budget rounds?
So one would assume it would be more difficult because the world is a much tougher place and things are much tougher. But we've now had 30 years of financial frameworks, give or take, and they've all followed, the negotiations have followed a set of iron laws in terms of how they start and how they end. So what happens? The Commission is the holder of the broad package. So the Commission gets to dictate broadly how the ambition, both the ambition in terms of the amount and then how this money will be spent and on what. So the Commission published, as it always does, its major document, July 25. Then the member states always, shock horror, this won't work, isn't enough, don't like how it's being spent, etc., etc. And then gradually it gets into the Council, and the Council has a very set way of negotiating financial frameworks. They set up a working party on the MFF, which has 3 subgroups, and they have a working party on own resources. So you have 2 negotiating tracks, very well set out, and then they develop something called the Negro box. You actually think it must be a physical box. It's not. It is essentially each of those working parties takes its piece of the negotiations and fills it up progressively with agreement. And of course, as always in the Council, nothing is ever agreed until everything is agreed, but also the initial negotiations are to try to get at what are the neuralgic issues. So you have a lot of square boxes. And the way in which these negotiations operate is you move from having lots of square boxes and disagreement to fewer square boxes, and then you have a failed European Council, which will be followed by a successful European Council.
In terms of the different positions of the net beneficiaries and the net contributors, obviously it very much depends on whether countries put our net contributors and net beneficiaries. Talk a little bit about how the balance of power amongst those has changed, and then maybe something about Ireland, which my understanding now is we are the biggest per person net contributor to the EU budget now.
So the biggest cleavage, there are lots of cleavages in budgetary negotiations in the EU, but the biggest cleavage bar none is net recipients, net contributors. The net contributors want to control the EU budget at the lowest possible increase because it's their budgets are affected by it. And the net beneficiaries are less cohesive in that you've net beneficiaries who favour agriculture more than cohesion, but then you have the cohesion. Those two groups, net contributors, net beneficiaries, always meet through the negotiations under the guise of friends of cohesion, that's one block, and whether you're being the frugals. And the hardcore of the frugals have continued to be Germany, the Netherlands, Sweden, and Denmark, but with lots of others. The Finns will join, Ireland will. Now, interestingly,
Ireland will or has?
So this is an important. Ireland is a net contributor. And in fact, it's probably not in Ireland's interest to have to do these negotiations. Why? There was a meeting recently of the net contributors, and Thomas Byrne, rightly in my view, decided he would not attend. He did not attend because he said he cannot declare Ireland in that camp when they're going to have to be an honest broker in the negotiations. And our ambassador, our permanent representative, attended but did not speak.
Really interesting.
So that to me was a signal of Ireland taking its presidency responsibilities really seriously. But Ireland, I think, is so one of the main ways Ireland still gets EU money is no longer cohesion, it's ag. So how's Ireland going to handle the tension between the new areas? So the traditional areas, cohesion and CAP, are distributive. The new areas, research, space, security, it's the quality of your ability to draw down the funds, whereas the other is pretty automatic. And how's Ireland, plus the fact that, as we saw with Mercosur, the strength of the Irish farming lobby remains remarkable despite the change in the economy. So how's Ireland going to manage the Irish interest, which is, it's very legitimate. Ireland was second largest per capita net contributor up to recently. It has, I think, surpassed Germany now. Now, that is, how's Ireland going to handle that tension plus the honest broker? And it's obviously, there will be, the other important thing to say is that the budgetary negotiations are handled by these working parties, and then it goes into Coreper and the GAC. Thomas Byrne would normally speak for Ireland at the GAC, so who's going to speak for Ireland at the GAC from the 1st of July onwards? And then, of course, it goes into the European Council, where Antonio Costa and his people take over the meeting, but they don't really take over the files, because the files have got to be properly advanced by the presidency to allow them to be sufficiently cooked to go into the European Council.
Broader question, Brigid. Is the presidency a negative in the sense that when countries are holding it, they are actually constrained from pursuing their interests?
So I don't think it's a constraint. I think it is a necessary service of membership of the EU. And I think it brings a number of important benefits, the most important of which is all your government and your civil servants get a deep, deep dive into every dossier in the EU, and they almost relearn the EU again and what the dynamics are, and rather than being focused only on the narrow. But it can.
Well, Bertie Ahern recently said it actually inevitably distracts from the domestic agenda as well. That's
so
negative.
I think that's also fair, but every country has to do it, and with the size of the EU now, it doesn't come around. It's 13 years since Ireland had the last one. So I think for 6 months.
I don't know. Why did we scrap it when we created the Antonio Costa position? Could you indicate questions there? Anybody wants to come in? Should it have been scrapped?
No, because then I think if you would then be creating permanent chairs of every council. I mean, there are hundreds of council bodies, and you would need permanent chairs of all of them. And you need to have both a member state perspective and a council secretariat perspective to make the council work. So I wouldn't scrap it under any circumstance.
Somebody who has seen this very much from the inside, Bobby McDonagh.
Indeed, a veteran of many MFF negotiations. Brigid, does Ireland have a major presentational problem, and how does it deal with it? Because the MFF is signalled as a major priority for the presidency, and yet, as you say, the European Council in December is doomed to failure. So is there a problem, and how does the presidency manage it?
So what is unclear at the moment is the European Council in December 25 said that conclusion by December 26 would be timely. In other words, it's a request to Ireland to do everything it possibly can to get the MFF through by December. For that to happen, we'll know more next week. There's a GAC next week and there's a European Council next week. And unless you see some meat in the European Council conclusions on the MFF next week, then you might wonder about the December 26 Council. But in my view, the absolute deadline for these negotiations is probably March 27. Why do I say that? It must be agreed with some space before the French elections. That would be my political judgment.
Sure, never takes a decision until the last possible moment.
And so if you're in the last Irish presidency, we concluded the MFF, and we did so in February. And we did so because there was failed European Council in December. So I would not assume that Ireland will conclude the negotiations, but for any outcome to be achieved, Ireland will have to have, those negotiations will have to have made major progress in the next 6 months.
Question over here. Again, show of hands there.
Yeah. I'm Una O'Dwyer, a member of the Institute. Thanks very much, Brigid, for a very clear description of how it all works. I'm curious about the possibility of Parliament, the European Parliament, and maybe other actors looking for new own resources, because they have done so in the past. I'm wondering, and in fact, of course, the EU budget as it currently stands, big and all as it is just over 1% of GNI. So if you have 1% with all the implications that are for all the new and difficult responsibilities of the EU, we've got a 1% budget for what I would call a 1% EU. So, could we not, should the Irish not support any effort that the Parliament might make to enhance that budget even marginally with new own resources?
So on own resources, they're a major part of the negotiation. The EU has struggled on own resources for 20 years now. The last MFF had the addition of the plastics, and the Commission has proposals on the table: CBAM, ETS, a temporary corporate tax. The Parliament has thrown in digital services. There's about 5 or 6 areas. They're not making much traction as of now. And I have to say that I think for the future of the EU budget, in 2 senses, you've got to reduce the national key. In other words, the amount of the contributions that comes directly from the member states that are highlighted in the bar charts. That's got to happen. So I would have thought, unless you see a reasonable increase in non-member state contributions from one of these various mechanisms, I think that would be a very bad outcome for these negotiations. Am I optimistic? I mean, it's been a terrible 20 years. The agenda has been, all these issues have been on the table for 20 years and no progress.
What percentage of the budget is own resources? Has it changed?
So the national contributions are part of own resources.
From VAT, is it?
But no, they're actual direct national contributions. So it's a proportion of VAT and then the traditional own resources from tariffs. But of course, they're declining. So the Commission is looking for 60 billion from new own resources. I'm glad you raised the issue of the Parliament, because I think there's another. So we know that majorities in the Parliament are more unsettled than they were and have shifted. And the consent of the Parliament is required for the MFF and for the own resources decision. And particularly, so the Parliament has asked for an even bigger budget than the Commission has proposed, about 10% higher.
That's always the case, though, isn't it?
But no, the question is, when, if ever, would the Parliament be tempted not to give consent? That's the question. I'm not saying they won't, but when might they be tempted? And this is a more unsettled Parliament than I've seen.
Question there.
Brigid, first, thank you so much for writing the recommendations on the MFF. I think that was such a helpful and insightful document. I have two quick questions. One about—
Could you just identify yourself?
I'm sorry?
Could you identify yourself?
Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Eric Jones. I'm director of the Robert Schuman Centre and successor to Brigid in the job that she used to have. And the first question is really about the Commission as a borrowing entity. You said at the start of your talk that we need the Commission to be a better borrowing entity, and that it would be best if they rolled over the debt. And my question is, what would it take to get them to roll over the debt? I mean, they already roll over the debt consistently in order to keep a yield curve across. They use a differentiated funding operation now, so it's not back-to-back lending. So what would it take to get them to roll over the grant part of Next Generation EU in the context of these negotiations? It would seem to give them some breathing space. The second question is more about the cleavage structure. You talk about net beneficiaries and net contributors, but does it also matter who benefits significantly from specific programs, like who has farmers, for example, and who doesn't?
So firstly, on the question of what it would take, the Commission would like that. But if you remember, it was a condition of getting agreement to the RFF in the first place that it would be repaid. I think that was unfortunate and a mistake. It would be much better for the EU if it rolled over and gave the breathing space in terms of, because I think it's 0.11% is earmarked for repaying. So I would have thought the barriers are not in the Commission. I think they're in the member states, and probably we could identify the capitals immediately. And I would put Berlin and The Hague in the top two. And then it does matter. So the cleavage I identified, the net contributors, net beneficiaries, is the macro cleavage. But underneath that, then you have individual member states assessing either as a net beneficiary or a net contributor who gets what at domestic level. And one of the developments in budgetary politics in the EU is they used to go and have these annual negotiations on the budget, and it didn't matter very much apart from the Thatcher era when she just said no every year. But the minute it went into Multiannual Financial Framework, after Delors 1, from Delors 2 onwards, every finance and economics ministry has a software package for the negotiations where they will judge as the numbers come in. They see the distributive. They try to analyze the distributive impacts in just the way that you've said. And I think for Ireland, the farming one is very tricky.
Thanks very much, John O'Brennan, Maynooth University. Who said the MFF was boring? Dan said it.
Dan said it.
This is a follow-up, actually, to Eric's question, and it's about the Next Generation EU and what it has actually delivered for the member states and for the European Union. I'm curious about the evidence that's coming in about the 750 billion, the extent of it that has been dispersed. and spent. I know there's a way to go yet, but what is the evidence showing us about the value added or about the impact of particular projects in particular member states?
And perhaps just to remind people again of another great conversation we had here with Tony Fahy, I think he's the head of the one of the audit function.
The Court of Auditors.
Court of Auditors.
Yes.
So Tony Murphy. We had a conversation with him maybe a year ago, and he was highly sceptical about the COVID spend. So just to that bit of context, John.
And I think it's what we know is that countries that found it difficult to spend EU money well continue to find it difficult to spend EU money well, and Italy continues to have a real problem with drawdown. And it really mattered to the Italian economy. It's an economy with underinvestment, and yet they're struggling to spend it. And in fact, I think the highest, the two countries that have drawn down the maximum or almost the maximum were Germany and France. State capacity matters when it comes to spending EU money.
And just a recollection that Italy had something called the super bonus.
Yes.
That they use a lot of that money as basically grants for people to refurbish their homes. That actually led to a bump in the national growth numbers because it increased fixed capital formation investment. So it actually led to a bump, leading people to think that this was having an effect. But once people stopped refurbishing their homes, then
it wasn't sustainable. It was a once-off.
That's it.
It was a once-off.
It didn't go into genuine capital expenditure.
Yeah.
Lady here. Sorry, and did I interrupt? Did you finish the question?
No, yeah. I mean, the evidence is mixed.
Sabine Lange, University of Ljubljana. Thank you very much for organizing this session. There are a number of decisions or proposals in the new proposal that are really unfavorable to smaller member states, drawing on the importance of capacity to actually manage the funds. There are higher thresholds that smaller countries can't reach. Like the minimum that you can manage is now lifted so much that they just can't manage. I'm wondering, do you see a possibility of small member states, which is like, 23, to in any way be able to change those management decisions, given that usually Commission wins on those and that are probably guided by the capacity and the experience from the RRF management? And how will this play out in the negotiations between the bigger funds and the competition element, and then the smaller funds where smaller member states used to get quite a number of pebbles. I don't know how to call it. Thank you.
So I don't think it's a small state issue, because there are small states in the EU that have very strong state capability and capacity. So the Nordics, I mean, they don't have a problem in drawing down EU funds. So I don't think it is not something that you will find a small state coalition on. You won't. I do think that there is, it's unclear to me yet how these big fund regulations are going to pan out. And it is necessary for the EU to try to simplify the budgetary processes. I mean, one of the promises I made to myself when I retired was I would never again apply for EU funding for anything. So, I mean, I buy into trying to make the systems less bureaucratic, but I do see the point that if there are smaller pots of money, then it may be easier to access them than the global. But what you'll find in those larger funds is they will be internally divided, horizon, space, etc., etc. So let's see how much changes. But I do think the Commission is committed to a shift in the management structures of the funding.
But just put you on the spot here, Brigid. This is a kind of detailed one, but it's gone out of my mind.
Yes, very quickly, absolutely brilliant. I think you've done a fantastic way of explaining everything clear. I just want to make sure that there's not another misunderstanding. The MFF is composed of three elements. The first element is own resources. There is no consent of Parliament. It's consulted. It's unanimity of the member states plus ratification. Then you have the regulation. That is consent. And Parliament uses the regulation consent to get also concessions on the own resources. And then you have the individual, about 30, 35 regulations. It's ordinary legislative procedure. I just wanted, because, just to be clear that there's no misunderstanding, but really, it's very...
I mean, as Jim said, this really is mega horizontal negotiations. Everything in the EU is touched by this in one way or another.
But the question that went out of my mind there is about agricultural spend. Listen to a discussion amongst economists, including Paul Krugman, and he said about how economists look at trade. We're not in Kansas anymore.
Yes.
Like the extent to which economists have changed their view because of security, the security environment on trade has been quite remarkable, and it's really across the profession. So I'm just wondering, in terms of how the EU focuses on the agricultural budget, is it giving more emphasis to areas where Europe is not self-sufficient, and using that as one of the criterion for deciding where to spend the money? Because it would make sense. You put the money, you subsidize the areas where we're not self-sufficient to increase production in areas where we have to import.
So I think the common agricultural policy is very much a legacy policy. It's not a strategic policy.
Dependency.
It's path dependency writ large and deep. Now they have moved from the headage payments, etc., etc. So they've done a lot, but you would not design the common agricultural policy as it was designed in the late 1950s, early 60s if you were starting now. You just wouldn't do it. But we should never forget that it was, in my view, a social policy. And food security mattered more back then and it still matters now, of course. So ag is just... the EU should spend less on ag and renationalise more of it and let member states decide how they want to subvent. But I think politically, no member state would want to have to deal with the urban-rural conflict at domestic level. You Europeanise at the urban-rural.
Yeah.
You in a way, it makes domestic politics easier. It takes one potential issue and shifts it to another level. So I'm very struck member states are not ever very keen on renationalisation. It's as if keep it there.
It's interesting. And just into the final one on Ireland, over the past 30 years, our economy has absolutely radically changed. We were hugely dependent on agriculture 30 years ago. Now we're pretty much at the norm, the average in the EU. Yet government still behaves as if agriculture is a central part. So our behaviour hasn't changed in line with our interests.
So I think the agribusiness sector is bigger, but on the other hand, just look at an electoral map and look at how many constituencies in Ireland have a lot of farmers in them. I mean, how many urban-only constituencies are there? So it's politics. It's politics. And we also know across Europe, for me, the fact that a Dutch farming party could really gain in a regional election was astounding to me, but it did. So it's not just Ireland. It is an interest that retains quite look at France, retains quite a lot of power.
Aren't we more like France? That sort of sense of rural life as being part of our national identity.
Yeah.
Final thoughts?
Nope. So
hey, wow.
I will give you one. I don't think the Irish presidency will conclude the MFF.